In the 1980s, there were two pillars of wrestling. In WWF, there was Hulk Hogan, while over in the NWA, there was Ric Flair. If you were a fan of the latter promotion, then you knew that while Hogan was the cartoon superstar, Flair was the real deal, arguably the greatest wrestler to have ever lived and one whose influence is still being felt to this day. So, how did he get to achieve this level of greatness? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey in Nature Boy, the Ric Flair Story. Richard Morgan Fleer was born on February 25, 1949 in Memphis, Tennessee. It's believed that his birth name was actually Fred Phillips, however, as his biological parents were unable to raise a child themselves, they put him up for an adoption when he was a baby, with him instead later being raised by Richard and Kathleen Fleer, this accounting for his change of name. And as a child in the Fleer household, Rick would do well, growing up in Edina, Minnesota and getting heavily involved in sports at school, mainly football, track and field, and amateur wrestling. And it was the latter where he would end up excelling at the most, this sparking an interest in him to train as a pro wrestler after leaving college in 1971. Now, of course, at this time, the secrets of pro wrestling were still closely guarded, and many fans continued to believe it was real fights that were taking place in the ring. So when the future legend showed up to his first day of training camp at American Wrestling Association promoter Vern Gagne's home in Minneapolis that winter, he was put through the ringer as the first few weeks saw he and his fellow potentials, which also included the Iron Sheik and Ken Patera, battered and bruised in order to weed out those who weren't serious about it. After that initial phase had passed then and the remaining trainees had learned some shoot wrestling techniques, they began to get let in on the secrets of the industry as they were taught how to tell a story and play to the crowd. From there, going on to face the likes of Dusty Rhodes, Wahoo McDaniel, and even Andre the Giant over his time in the AWA during the next 2 years. By 1974, he had fallen under the attention of Jim Crockett, who subsequently invited him to go down south and join his own promotion, something which Flair readily accepted as this was still the territory days when moving from place to place every few years was a common practice. What Flair didn't realize at the time, though, was that Jim Crockett Promotions and the company which would later be birthed out of its ashes, WCW, would become his home for most of the next 3 decades, with him rising to such heights there that he would eventually be considered one of, if not the, greatest to ever lace up a pair of boots. Before that could happen, however, there was a near tragedy, as on October 4, 1975, Rick would be in a plane crash which left him with a broken back in 3 places. Initially, it looked like the hopeful career of the youngster was over before it could really get started, but the future NWA champion would not give up that easily. And so, after going through rigorous physiotherapy and altering his in-ring style so he would take less bumps onto his back by executing what would become known as the Flair Flop, he was able to return to the ring just 3 months later, at which time he began developing the Nature Boy gimmick, a playboy heel character that was, let's just say, heavily borrowed from Buddy Rogers. Still, Rogers didn't seem to mind. He even gave Flair his blessing, in fact, by putting him over in a one-on-one encounter a few years later. And of course, by this time, Rick was already establishing himself as one of the top talents in the industry, as he had a series of feuds with the likes of Ricky Steamboat, Roddy Piper, Jimmy Snuka, and Greg Valentine, each over the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. Now, for those that don't know, the governing body of wrestling in America at the time was the National Wrestling Alliance, an almost mafia-like group that controlled who the big champions were and where they would travel to across any promotion that were affiliated with them. Jim Crockett Promotions, like pretty much every federation outside of WWE and AWA, was a part of this collective, and so, wanting the prestige of having the NWA World's Champion on the roster, they began campaigning for Flair to get the spot. Something that the NWA board were only too happy to do, as they had already been watching the youngsters rise to the top with careful attention over the last few years by this point. That was how on September 17, 1981 then, the Nature Boy won his first ever world title when he beat Dusty Rhodes, from there on in becoming the fighting champion who would represent the NWA by traveling from promotion to promotion, defending the belt against each place's top star and making them look like $1 million in the process. This exposed Flair to a much wider audience, and soon, it wasn't just the Carolinas that were proclaiming him to be the best, it was the entire North American wrestling industry. and by 1983, Ric would cement himself as the NWA's top man when he beat Harley Race in a steel cage match at the first ever Starrcade, this giving him his second NWA World Title win and seeing him begin to tour around the world with the belt, taking it to places as far as Japan, where he would defend against All Japan Pro Wrestling's Genichiro Tenryu, Riki Chosu, and Jumbo Tsuruta. Back stateside, and he would also take on an A-list of challengers as he fended off the likes of Kerry Von Erich and Tully Blanchard. At this point, he also formed wrestling's first supergroup as, alongside Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, and Tully Blanchard, he would become a founding member of the Four Horsemen, a heel faction that, managed by J.J. Dillon, would dominate Jim Crockett Promotions for the next decade by mauling every babyface in their sights, most memorably Dusty Rhodes during he and Ric's now iconic feud in the lead-up to Starrcade 1985. And it wasn't just in the ring that these four were a closely knit unit. No, the partying done outside of it would also become legendary, with Flair in particular becoming known for fully living up to the gimmick of the limousine-riding, jet-flying, kiss-stealing, wheeling-dealing son of a gun that would style and profile wherever he went, making him the object of desire for women and envy of men everywhere. In fact, Flair claims to have slept with around 10,000 women over the course of his life, something which put a huge strain on his home life as by then he was already on his second marriage, this being the one that would give him his children Reed and Ashley, the latter of whom would one day go on to huge success of her own as Charlotte. Back in the ring, however, he was continuing to prove that he was the best in the business, often working off his hangovers by wrestling for over an hour on any given night and always stealing the show with his in-ring prowess, his colorful robes, and his signature cry of "Woo!", which the crowd would often yell back whenever he hit one of his patented knife-edge chops. Yes, by this point, there was a section of the audience who had begun cheering the Nature Boy, and to be fair, they couldn't help themselves. Heel or face, he was usually the most entertaining person in the building. That was what led him to go through the rest of the 80s, dropping the NWA title to the next big babyface whenever necessary, but always winning it back in the end, as Jim Crockett, who had by then consolidated much of the NWA into his own promotion, often relied on him to draw crowds and put on a stellar main event match. In fact, in early 1988, Flair would be called upon to help crown Crockett's next big babyface character, Sting, something the Nature Boy would do expertly as he took the up-and-comer to an epic 45-minute draw at the inaugural Clash of Champions, the Stinger from that day on becoming one of the pillars of the promotion and a top rival of Ric's for the rest of each of their careers. Yes, everyone knew that if you wanted to make someone look good, then you put them in the ring with the champ, but he was equally adept at making himself shine too, and there's perhaps no finer example of this than his trilogy of bouts with Ricky Steamboat in 1989, a series that's still considered by many to this day to represent the high watermark of in-ring wrestling. The first one happened at the Chi-Town Rumble on February 20th and saw the challenger pick up the pinfall to win the world's title. After that, the two men met again in a 2 out of 3 falls match at April 2nd's Clash of the Champions 4 Ragin' Cajun, where Steamboat would once again get a win, albeit a disputed one this time. That disputed finish would lead to the third and final meeting between the two at May 7th's Wrestle War, where Ric would end things by getting his title back. Now, this final match would be the one that got the Match of the Year award amongst readers of Pro Wrestling Illustrated that year, but really, you could take all three as one big story, with the combined contest widely being regarded to be both men's masterpiece. Ricky Steamboat even preferring it to his legendary WrestleMania 3 bout against Randy Savage. After this, the Nature Boy had no intentions of slowing down, because he segued straight into a program with Terry Funk, one which would see him formally turn babyface as he had a brutal I Quit match with the Texan at Clash of Champions 9 New York Knockout, Flair coming out victorious in the end. After that, going into 1990, he reignited his feud with Sting. This round of the feud, though while still great, would unfortunately suffer some of the pitfalls of early 90s WCW, the company that Jim Crockett Promotions had morphed into after Ted Turner bought it over 2 years prior. Yes, Ric would at this time be written to disguise himself as the Black Scorpion, a masked figure who haunted the Stinger for months before finally revealing himself in one of the biggest flops of that company's history at the time. Storyline aside though, the matches were still great, and the two would trade the NWA World's title back and forth until the Minnesota native would get his gold back in January of 1991, putting a pause on the program for now. And with WCW formally creating all of their own titles at this time too, the NWA champion would also become the first ever WCW World Champion, a belt he would largely go on to define for the rest of the company's lifespan. Still, even with this honor being given to him, all was not well behind the scenes at WCW, as Jim Herd, a former Pizza Hut manager with no apparent understanding of the wrestling business, had been brought in as the company's new president. Not realizing how important Flair was to fans, Herd wanted the champion to shave his head and take on a Spartacus gimmick, completely misunderstanding what audiences loved about him. Of course, Ric vetoed this, and that was what led to him eventually getting fired in the spring of 1991, a decision that was widely rejected by live crowds everywhere at the time. But that wasn't the only mistake Herd had made, because when he was fired, the Nature Boy was still in possession of the big gold belt, which served as WCW's title at the time. With this in mind then, Vince McMahon asked him to bring it with him to TV when he signed him soon thereafter, this beginning a storyline where Flair would be led onto TV by Bobby Heenan and Mr. Perfect, who would each proclaim him to be the real world's champion, setting him on what many assumed was an eventual collision course with Hulk Hogan. And as the weeks went on, things looked to be moving in that direction, as Flair helped The Undertaker to beat Hogan for the WWE title at the November 27th Survivor Series, from there going on to enter the 1992 Royal Rumble where, as the belt had been vacated due to the prior controversy, it was up for grabs in the Rumble match itself. On that night, the WCW stalwart entered at number 3, and from there lasted the distance as he put on a 5-star performance, taking on all comers before winning the whole thing to become the undisputed world champion. It was a huge moment for Ric and a sign that the boss was ready to go all in with him, so it came as a surprise to no one when in the weeks that followed, he began working the house show circuit with the Hulkster in preparation for a big WrestleMania showdown. Unfortunately though, this match would never come to pass. Some have argued that a lifetime of WWE telling its fans to disregard the competition made them refuse to take Flair seriously, while others have said that the politics of getting Hogan and Flair to agree to a match layout hobbled things. In the end, it's probably a combination of all of this, but the end result was the same either way. At WrestleMania 8, Hulk would fight Sid in the main event, while below them on the card, the Nature Boy would face off with Randy Savage for the WWE title, a match he would ultimately lose. Modern-day fans have regarded this as one of the company's biggest missed opportunities, but we did end up getting the match later on in WCW, just after much of the magic had faded. Back in WWE, however, and the now former champion would continue to feud with both Savage and the Ultimate Warrior before regaining his gold at a house show on September 1st of that year. This, as it turned out, was being done as a setup for Vince to coronate his next big star, as on October 12th, Flair was beaten once again by Bret Hart, that starting the Hitman's first reign at the top. And it soon became apparent that this was how McMahon planned to use Ric as time went on, as a legend that could get younger talent over. Ric disagreed with this assessment of his spot on the card, however, and so the two ended up coming to a very cordial agreement that would see the two-time WWE champion leave the company with no hard feelings, jumping back over to his home base of WCW from there as, by then, management had changed and the company were only happy to welcome him back. Upon his return to WCW, Flair set about re-establishing himself as the face of the brand by, at different times, winning the NWA and WCW world titles from Barry Windham and Vader respectively. After that, he had a series of great matches against old rivals like Ricky Steamboat and Sting, as well as new ones like Steven Regal. And by 1994, when Hulk Hogan had jumped ship to the company, fans finally got a chance to see the long-awaited showdown between the two men, though this time, for as much as they tried, they couldn't quite live up to the expectations that had been set for them. Their rivalry would continue on for a while though, with Flair often being used as a foil to the Hulkster and jobbing out to him in turn. And while he was happy to lose if the situation called for it, Flair began to increasingly feel like he was being disrespected, as WCW's new president by this point, Eric Bischoff, had made it clear that he saw Ric as a relic of the past and someone he was no longer interested in using as the face of his modern version of the company. The only problem was that fans still loved Flair, and they would often let Bischoff know with the reactions they gave him. Still, the boss insisted on pushing the former champion and his ever-changing roster of Four Horsemen stablemates down into a more of a mid-card position, only really being brought up to the main event when Hogan needed someone to beat. And this only got worse in 1996 when the NWO was formed and the wrestling world changed forever. By then, everyone was fully behind this new anarchic style this brought to the show, and so, more and more, Ric Flair was treated like an afterthought. This would even be reflected in the people who would join the Horsemen at this time, with the likes of Steve "Mongo" McMichael not quite matching up to the caliber of former members. By April of 1998, Flair would be pulled from TV altogether after the heat between him and Bischoff finally boiled over. He wouldn't return until September, at which point he cut a blistering shoot promo on the boss, calling him out for all his failings. And these failings would soon become apparent to the wrestling industry as a whole, because WCW was about to start its internal collapse, crumbling to the might of WWE's Attitude Era over the next couple of years until it completely went out of business in March of 2001. By this point, Rick was so disenfranchised with the company he had once loved, though, he was happy to see it die. And so he and Sting laid it to rest on the final episode of Nitro on March 23rd of that year, when they had the show's last ever match. After that, the Nature Boy took the next year off, waiting to see how WWE would manage their purchase of the company. This didn't go well as it turned out, but the invasion angle is a whole other story that could cover a video in itself. What's important here is that after that was over, Flair returned to WWE TV on November 19, 2001 to announce that he had kayfabe purchased half of the company and would be Vince McMahon's co-chairman from there on in. This led to a feud between the two, with them even fighting it out at the 2002 Royal Rumble, Rick's first match in a WWE ring in almost a decade. After that, he got a chance to challenge The Undertaker at WrestleMania 18, a match which the Nature Boy has since said was able to revive his confidence in himself, as years of being put down in WCW had left him feeling like he wasn't the same man anymore. He was, however, sure he was a little older and a little slower, but even at this stage, Rick was better than most, and he continued to prove this as he wrestled while also acting as the owner of Raw during the company's first brand split. That was until June 10th of that year, of course, because it was then that he would lose a rematch with McMahon, this one being for sole ownership of the company. From there, he soon formed an alliance with The Game, Randy Orton, and Batista that would become known as Evolution, one of the most decorated stables in wrestling history, almost on par with that of the Four Horsemen. And while a member of Evolution, Rick would become tag team champions with Batista on 2 separate occasions, proving that he still had it after all those years. When the group eventually disbanded, however, it became clear that things were winding down for the 16-time champion. He had a series of feuds with the likes of Edge and Mick Foley over the next few years, even briefly becoming Intercontinental Champion. But by 2008, Vince McMahon saw that his time was coming, and so he laid out a stipulation that when Flair lost his next match, he would have to retire. This storyline climaxed at WrestleMania 24 where, in one of the most emotional moments in WWE history, just days after having been inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, Shawn Michaels proclaimed his love for Ric Flair before putting him down once and for all, ending his heralded in-ring career in the best possible way, a moment that was universally loved by both fans and critics. Of course, that wasn't the end of the story, though. Rick, being uncomfortable with retirement at this point, did return to have a few matches in both Ring of Honor and TNA, but has since expressed regret for this, instead wishing to remember that night at WrestleMania as the real end to his career. Since then, he's remained a recurring presence on WWE, making numerous appearances over the years, and even getting a second Hall of Fame induction as part of the Four Horsemen in 2012. In recent years, he's become most notable amongst younger fans for being the father of Charlotte, who herself has gone on to reach great heights within the industry, becoming one of the first women to ever main event a WrestleMania. And Rick seems happy to live vicariously through her now, finally putting his days in the ring to bed, but leaving behind a legacy that few, if any, can match. Even when John Cena won his 16th world title at the 2017 Royal Rumble, fans were quick to point out that Flair still held the real record, one he'll likely hold forever at this point, as it's hard to imagine anyone reaching those levels of success again. Yes, when all is said and done, the Nature Boy might just be the greatest wrestler of all time. It's certainly an opinion shared by many of his peers such as Steve Austin, Triple H, and countless others. So put on your lizard shoes, Rolex watch, and do some styling and profiling in his honor today, because in the words of the man himself, diamonds are forever, and so is Ric Flair. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.